Hey everyone. Great day, isn't it? Yeah. Good day to be here. For those of you who are standing, there's actually an overflow room, and this room and this stage and everything we see here is actually being live projected over there, so you can sit down and there'll probably some snacks in there as well. So if you want to stand and be here, that's great as well. My name is Harvey Young, and I am the One Book faculty chair, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the One Book One Northwestern keynote. And I want to tell you a bit about One Book One Northwestern before formally inviting Dr. Claude Steele up on stage here to offer the keynote. One Book One Northwestern, sponsored by the Office of the President. One Book is a community-wide reading program that seeks to engage all of Northwestern in a common discussion about an important issue. Each year's selection is chosen from a long list of nominated books, selected by a committee consisting of a cross-section of students, staff, and faculty. And what the committee does is, they consider a number of factors. They consider, the social, the relevance, the importance of the issue addressed in the book. Because these books are sent out over the summer, they're concerned about readability. Like, is this a book you cannot put down and you must read, even if you're sitting on the beach looking at, I don't know, the sunrise or set. It's a combination of readability, scholarly rigor, and its relevance to the broad Northwestern community that makes One Book rise to the top. And that book this year was Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. Whistling Vivaldi is a reflection of a major scholar, an esteemed social psychologist on his career studying stereotype threat and the contingencies of identity. It is a powerful book that helps us to see the effects of how we engage others, to see the effects of how we engage others in the world. Dr. Steele, through his book, teaches us valuable lessons. For example, by being mindful of how we interact with people, in addition to making a concerted effort to be inclusive and welcoming, we can foster the creation of environments where everyone can perform their very best. The One Book Committee took to heart the benefits of inclusion, as well as the dangers of unchecked, freely circulating stereotypes. In response to Dr. Steele's charge, we set out to create lots and lots and lots of opportunities for a series of intimate discussions where people could come together and share their experiences with one another, where they could talk about the wide-ranging relevance of Dr. Steele's work. We held book group discussions with Northwestern faculty members and staff members and students from all across campus. We had discussions with parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles who were visiting for family weekends. Sort of staff, university instructors at every level joined us in talking about the importance of Whistling Vivaldi. And all those discussions were facilitated by a One Book Northwestern steering committee member or an appointed ally. Over 3 months, we sent buses, lots and lots and lots and lots of buses of staff and students and faculty, each carrying a One Book One Northwestern steering committee member as a facilitator to visit and discuss a traveling exhibit on the history of race that One Book co-sponsored, and it was held at it was hosted by the Olympic Holocaust Museum. We partnered with the Block Museum and the Word Center for the Performing Arts on co-sponsored events, including discussions on subjective standards of beauty, as well as the widespread impact of hate crimes based upon sexual identity. Now, these are just a sampling of more than 40 events, 40 distinct events, and I think of discussions as being one. Right? He just says how many there are, probably 80 or so individual events. Inspired by Dr. Steele's book. There are plenty of events on the horizon. We're like 2/3 of the way through, and our activities go through June. So I encourage you to go in the hallway and pick up a One Book, One Northwestern brochure. And there's a lot coming up. For example, in 2 weeks, there's a panel on the experience of women in the business of sports. You can see the slide up there. And that features a series of recognizable on-air personalities who will come here and talk about their experiences working in the business of sports, and also lead small group breakout discussions. It is this commitment to focused, meaningful discussions that has stood at the heart of this year's One Book, One Northwestern programming. A sense of belonging emerges from looking at a person in the eye, recognizing that we are all part of one community, daring to engage in what at times can be difficult conversations. There is a special charge in being seen and in knowing that people, including today's speaker, are looking at you, looking you in the eye, right, and asking you to join him and join all of us in helping to chip away and lessen the devastating effects of stereotype threat. Some conversations are too important to be had at a distance. Dr. Steele has generously shared his time with our community, and in doing so has allowed One Book One Northwestern to remove some of the impediments of distance. He has partnered in 8 sponsored One Book One Northwestern activities, 8 of them. Thanks to these multiple engagements, more than 2,000 people have been able to meet with, talk with, hear, and engage Dr. Steele. In addition, Dr. Steele has allowed today's address, today's talk, to be recorded, and then to have that rebroadcast and represented for the One Book One Northwestern website, so more and more people can actually share this conversation. So the last thing I want to do is I want to actually formally introduce Dr. Steele. Dr. Steele is the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, the Chief Academic Officer at UC Berkeley. Previously, he served as the Provost at Columbia University, the Dean of the School of Education at Stanford University, and the Director of several major research institutions at Stanford, including the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and also the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Steele has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Education, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. He is a member of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Board of Directors and the board of the Russell Sage Foundation. His many honors are too numerous to mention, but I'm going to single out 2 for us. One is the fact that he received the Dean's Teaching Award from Stanford University, which recognizes his excellence and commitment to education, teaching, and mentoring students. And the second is that he holds an honorary doctorate from Northwestern University, right? Which makes him a wildcat for life. Please join me in welcoming home our fellow wildcat, Dr. Claude Steele.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction and the description of the One Book program. It's kind of an amazing thing. I'm going to steal the whole idea and take it back home with me. But it's a pleasure to be here. Chicago is my wife and my hometown, and it's always a pleasure to come back, even in February. We weren't deluded. And we have a special affection for Northwestern. They have had over a good number of years a lot of interest in our research, and we've had a lot of interaction for many years now, and it's a real pleasure to come back and to see old friends and to check in on what's going on. And we look to you guys for leadership in many of these areas, and so it's a pleasure to come back in that regard too. I will just, my mission is just to talk about stereotype threat and its implications primarily for higher education. I will, as I often say at this point, I'll be making the case that these social psychological phenomenon, stereotype threats, social identity threat in general, that they're very important, that they affect our daily lives, that everybody experiences them. They affect, who we feel comfortable with, what regions of the country we live in, how we perform in certain tasks, intellectual tasks, athletic tasks, all kinds of things. So I'm going to be making the case that these 2 kind of Delphic psychological, social psychological phenomena are important, but I don't want to be depressing. And so, so I'm going to spend as little time, kind of reviewing the concept as I can get away with, and more time talking about what to do about it, how to address it in university life, which is something that I'm grateful to see you guys are interested in, and on a daily basis, I'm deeply interested in it as well. The other thing that I always say is I like to kind of underscore one of the lessons we got from this research is that how important context is, the immediate context that a person is in, how important that is with regard to how we behave, how we perform, and how we function. We tend to, when we think about people, we tend to decontextualize ourselves, sort of pull ourselves out of a context and assume that everything they do and how well they perform and so forth is due to something more or less internal, their motivation and talents, these kinds of things. But one of the things, the lessons we've learned from this research is how dependent or critical the context is, and the sustained context that people are in. What a huge role that has in how well we perform, big choices we make about where we want to live our lives, what careers we want to take up, and so on. So that's a subtext that I always want to alert people to, because I think as when we get to remedies, if problems originate in context, that's often more changeable and accessible than if they're rooted deeply inside the psyche in some area. So there lies a kernel of hope in these areas. Well, I'll follow this basic outline. Just a little bit about the problem that we got interested in that started this research. Then a little bit about some examples of stereotype threat, and then we'll get into the kind of remedies. I'll try to describe the concept in the middle of the talk, and then we'll get into the remedies that way. The problem is, as I have talked, I think maybe 6 or 7 times in the last couple of days, so I'm very grateful that there's an audience here at all. So I don't know, I'm at great risk of repeating myself, so just I beg your forgiveness in that respect right at the outset. But the problem is known in the psychometric literature as an underperformance phenomenon. Underperformance. And I first noticed this when I was a new professor at the University of Michigan, and as is the fate of many minority faculty, I was almost immediately assigned to the Minority Student Recruitment and Retention Committee. And on the first meeting, on the top of the stack of papers was a graph that had the GPA, the cumulative GPA of Michigan students, graphed out as a function of the SAT scores they had when they entered Michigan. And what you saw was that kids who came in with higher SAT scores tended to a very surprisingly slight degree have somewhat higher grade point averages at Michigan than kids who come in with lower scores. So that's a standard relationship, not too much to it. But they'd also broken out the same kind of data for African American students separately. And that's what was very surprising to me. Because at each level of SAT score, African American students were winding up with lower cumulative GPAs than other students with the same SAT score. And that was the puzzle. Why should that be? I kind of assumed to that point that if you'd gotten everybody similarly, equally prepared for academic work at that level, that they would perform pretty much the same. There shouldn't be any reason too much of a reason for a difference. If they got the same SAT scores, you'd kind of expect the same grades. But that wasn't happening. And it was an attempt to sort of understand why that wasn't happening that launched this research. It was also, I hasten to point out, within weeks we found out that the same thing was true for women in advanced math courses and quantitatively based courses at the University of Michigan. That in those advanced difficult courses, not the entry-level gateway courses, but the more advanced one, you got the same underperformance. That women with the same SAT scores wound up with lower grades in those courses than did men. And that added to the puzzle, and then we got sort of, scholarly about it. We were, after all, scholars, and so we looked at the literature and found out, lo and behold, underperformance is a national phenomenon. It happens everywhere. Sadly, it happens everywhere, from 6th grade classrooms to Stanford Medical School. You find this kind of underperformance where a group whose intellectual abilities are negatively stereotyped in the larger society, when they're doing difficult work up against the sort of frontiers of their skills, tend to underperform in relation to other people with the same preparation. That was the phenomenon. It's a lawful phenomenon. And our basic research question is, why on earth would that be the case? Once you've got preparation the same, you should have performance the same. And if you don't, then something else is going on. And I'll spare you about 6 or 7 years of research and give you the answer. Or I have to say, in all honesty, part of the answer. I think part of the answer is stereotype threat. And in our research, often it turns out to be a big part of the answer. But I do think there are other factors involved, other kinds of social psychological factors are involved. I think there's still room for considerable discovery in this area. But what we found in our research is that this thing that we could best describe after, as I say, about 6 or 7 years of working on it, the phenomenon of stereotype threat seemed to play a big factor. And that concept is a very simple concept. We found it by working on this problem and trying to understand this problem, but there's just no doubt that everybody has some form of stereotype threat, experiences it probably on a daily, at least every other day basis. I think it's a regular feature of life. And the definition of it is very simple. It's whenever you're doing something or you're in a situation where a negative stereotype about one of your identities, your age, your sex, your race, your sexual orientation, your religion, your region of the country. You can see I can just go on and on naming social identities. And for each one of these, you can probably, if I had you, take out a piece of paper and write down what some negative stereotypes about that group might be. And whenever you're in a situation, having one of those identities, doing something for which one of those negative stereotypes is relevant, you know something. You know that you could be seen or treated in terms of that stereotype. You know that's a possibility. And if the thing that you're doing is really important to you, then the prospect of being seen that way can be upsetting and distracting and undermining and just quite burdensome. And that's really what stereotype threat is. It's just being in situations where, because of an identity you have, you know at some level, often sort of semi-conscious, that you could be seen in not so good a light based on stereotypes about that identity. It's not incidental, but I think a lot about this in relation to age these days. There are just stereotypes out there, and you are often in circumstances where they're relevant. And that's the key thing, relevance of the stereotype to what you're doing. Then you can feel this pressure. You can see it's not necessarily an internal thing. It comes from your knowing how other people in your society might see you, and that you know that other people in your society know these stereotypes, and when you're in circumstances where they're relevant, they could see you that way. It's just as simple as that. You don't have to assume any really deep psychological architecture to explain it, anything really deeply internal. It's a situational threat. And you can experience it in one situation, in turn talk to somebody 45 degrees, talk to somebody in a different conversation and not feel it at all. It's not so much an internalized thing. I'll come back to that in more detail. But it's a situational, circumstantial thing. I think it's a cousin to just, anxiety about judgment of any sort. I always use this example of my Aunt Ruby, who had put out in the family the reputation that our family liked to show off by bringing big fancy dishes to Thanksgiving dinner. And so there you are, preparing on Thanksgiving morning your dish, and it's as if Aunt Ruby is in the room with you. You know what I mean? The prospect of her seeing you one way or the other. Should you put the marshmallows on the sweet potatoes or not put the marshmallows? You're kind of worried about negotiating in relation to this judgment. Well, the difference of stereotype threat is just simply that everybody knows this reputation about you based on having this identity. Everybody could think this. It's not just Aunt Ruby who has this opinion, but in your society, everybody's got this stereotype about your group. And whenever it's relevant, you could be seen that way. You don't know if you're going to be seen that way. I've been saying in the last couple of days, it's like having a snake in the house. You don't quite know if this is a big snake or a little snake or a poisonous snake or what it is, but all of a sudden you're lit up with vigilance about what could be there. And you just can't, sort of flop down on the couch and watch a football game with the snake possibly in the house. It unsettles everything. It unsettles everything. And the prospect of being seen that way can be, especially in domains that you care about, unsettling. Well, I've tried to get examples that are sort of uncommon. One is suggested to me by my students, is the first several minutes from the movie 8 Mile, which is a kind of biography of the white rapper Eminem. And we were looking for where is it that a white male in this society might feel a negative stereotype about intellectual performance. And that turns out to be an incredibly vivid display of that. Because the negative stereotype he's subject to, as somebody who's white and who has decided, for whatever reasons, to become a great rapper, he's now entering a black art form. And in that world, the idea of being lame or being bad at it is sort of seen as kind of a white thing. You're white with a mic. You're not cool, man. You can't really do this. You can't do this. So the first part of the movie is him. These very intense performances. They go on stage, two rappers, flip of the coin. The first rapper has to think up creatively these horrifying insults of the poor second rapper who's standing here and lost the flip of the coin. And he has to be creative. He has to do it in rhyme, and he has to do it in time. And there's a crowd pulsing. So it's a very intense intellectual performance. And the poor second rapper, he has to defend himself against these heinous allegations made by the first rapper, and he has to do it, make it up on the spot, he has to do it creatively, and he has to do it in time, and he has to do it in rhyme. And so you see this happen, and poor Eminem loses the first coin flip. The other guy, right away levels the "you're white with a mic" stereotype at him. And then it's his turn, and not a word can come out of his mouth. He just kind of caves in and sort of walks off stage and hands the mic to the DJ. Well, it's a great illustration because you see a lot of the things in that illustration, in that footage, that I think are critical to understanding where stereotype threat comes from, how he's treated, what the stereotypes over his head are. That for him to get on stage, he has to convince the stage guard, I guess, that he really belongs there. He's a white guy. What are you doing back here? He tries to throw him out, and the black guy has to eventually vouch for him being there. He's seen that he doesn't really belong there. And then the crowd is yelling these things at him. So you begin to see that just the pressure of the situation makes this threat, in this instance, immobilizing. But fortunately, the rest of the movie is how he overcomes this. It does become one of the greatest rappers of all time, and can really do amazingly well in that situation. So it's a dramatically interesting story if you're interested in stereotype threat examples. I don't know, or rapping, maybe you're interested in that. But the question in our research is more basic. Does this stereotype threat go to school? Does it play a role in school? And that is a case where, again, I think still, as a matter of almost the nature of our language, we tend to think of intellectual performance and learning as things that, outside of context, as if the context doesn't make that much difference. If you're smart, you're smart. If you're not smart, you're not smart. And that's kind of how we think about it. You give a test to somebody, and within an hour or two, you can get a pretty good assessment of how smart they are, and you can make decisions about their future based on this thing, and because pretty much ability is ability, and it doesn't vary that much as a function of context. And the idea here is that a stereotype threat is a viable account of at least some of the underperformance that we are observing. You have to really put it up against that challenge. Can it affect intellectual performance? In particular, we chose at the outset, almost incidentally, standardized test performance. But before I describe just a luster of experiments there, I do have one clip that's kind of fun to see. I think a lot of psychologists in the room have seen this many times. This is the blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment that has an interesting illustration of this. This was an experiment done really the first time, the day after Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. Jane Elliott, a school teacher in basically all-white Riceville, Iowa, wanted to come up with a demonstration that would help her kids understand in part what Martin Luther King's life was about. So she stayed up that night and she sewed and ironed collars that were either blue or brown. And the next day she went into class and she had the brown-eyed students put on the collars. And she stood in front of the class and stigmatized brown-eyed students. This is an experiment that, thank God, could not be done with any modern human subject review committee. So But it was done by her, and then the reenactment was filmed by ABC News, and you can go online and you can follow what happens to all these students, and there's debates about it and so on. But what she did to stigmatize them was have them wear that collar, and she stood in front of the class at the beginning of the day and said, look, brown-eyed people are not good people. They don't smell that good. They're not that smart. And I think they should get up and move to the back of the classroom. And she makes them get up and move to the back of the classroom. And the cameras catch, even in the enactment, just a shock of, 5th, 6th grade students enduring this kind of experience, and how they huddle together in the playground and so on. The only fairness in the situation is that the next day she has the blue-eyed students put on blue collars, and she stigmatizes them in the same way she had stigmatized the brown-eyed students the day before. So then she says, blue-eyed people are not good people, and they don't smell that good. And she goes through the same thing, and you see the same crushing kind of experience there. Well, it's interesting in many ways, but one of the things in the early documentary is a little side scene in which you see her, Jane Elliott, working with her students through a card pack of problems. And what she's doing is measuring how fast they go through the card pack. And what you're about to see is the effect of wearing collars on how fast they go through this card pack. So let me see if I can get this thing going.
I use what we call phonics. We use the card pack. And the children, the brown-eyed children, were in the low class the first day, and it took them 5.5 minutes to get through the card pack. The second day, it took them 2.5 minutes. The only thing that had changed was the fact that now they were superior people.
I went faster than I've ever had anyone go through the card pack. Why couldn't you get them yesterday? You think the collars kept you?
Thinking about the collars. I could get roll around.
Oh, and you couldn't think as well with the collars on. 4 minutes and 18 seconds.
I know we looked in the notebook.
How long did it take you yesterday?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. How long did it take you today?
4 minutes and 18 seconds.
What happened?
And,
Why? What are you thinking of?
this.
So you get, it's a good sort of visual of the impact that it might have on cognitive academic function. It's a heavy-handed instantiation of stigma. And thank goodness in modern life, generally we don't have that level of that heavy-handedness of stigma. So there is a basic research question, which is, well, could something like just the stereotype that we're talking about, that form of instantiation of a stigma or of a making of a negative stereotype relevant to your academic performance, would that be enough to actually undermine real test performance? So I'll just go back to one of the very early experiments we did to get at that question, similar to this demonstration. We had men and women, usually sophomores at the University of Michigan, who were really, really good math students. They had very high math scores, and they had at least 2 calculus courses, got at least B pluses in calculus. They said that math was important to their personal goals and to their career goals and the like. So this was a very select group of people. We brought them into the laboratory one at a time, and we gave them a very difficult half-hour section of the graduate record exam in math that you take. And that's not the general quantitative section, it's the section you take if you're a math major. So it's a hard math test. It's frustrating. And that is a critical feature of this. Our reasoning was that it would be frustration that would make this a very different experience for the women than for the men. The men would experience frustration on this test because they cared a lot about math, they thought they were good at it, and here they were sort of up against the wall here. And they could begin to have all kinds of thoughts, like, geez, maybe I'm not as good at math as I thought, and really should I be an engineer, or maybe I should, I don't know, do something else, or they could have all that kind of ideation. But in addition to that, women would have another kind of ideation to deal with there, which is the ideation coming from the relevance of the stereotype. That stereotype is alleging a kind of possible, well, limitation of ability, biologically rooted, gender-based limitation of ability. And that in this particular situation, maybe that's what is causing this frustration. So it's the frustration that makes the stereotype in the sky, if you will, relevant as a person, as an interpretation of what's happening personally to the person. No frustration, you don't have to go there and think about it. But with the frustration in the situation, it makes the stereotype relevant as something that's very difficult to just sweep aside. And so our reasoning was that for these women who cared so much about math, this would be a very different situation. There'd be a lot of counter-arguing, resisting the stereotype going on. There'd be a whole lot of dialogue, internal dialogue, kind of resisting it, and that would undermine their performance, and that's exactly what happened, is that they performed a full standard deviation lower than the men in that situation. And so we were sad by that, but as scientists, kind of happy. Because we had in the laboratory now exactly what we see in real life in the underperformance phenomenon. We had underperformance there. We knew these men and women were the same in terms of their preparation and skills, but we created a circumstance that produced the underperformance, and now we can take it apart. And I can't believe how naive we were. It's astonishing to me in retrospect, but as soon as we started running around the lab talking about these data, people said, wait a minute, maybe you just confirmed this here. Maybe you just confirmed that you've given them a very difficult math test, and maybe that's where this gender difference in math ability manifests itself, and that's all you got. So that, I've got to say, was one of the more painful days in my life. And how I didn't expect it, it must be due to repression or something like that. I don't know. But this was disturbing, and it was quite a deal for all of us. Steve Spencer, especially, and I were working on this, and it was quite a deal. So we had to come up with a way of separating these two explanations. It took us a long time, but eventually we came up with something that was pretty simple. We tried things that were interesting because they didn't work. You can't, as it turns out, just tell people that a stereotype is wrong and give them evidence that a stereotype is wrong and have them really believe that. Because the stereotypes seem to be with us by, as I was saying the other day, it's a matter of consensus. I use a stereotype because I know other people use it. And it's not really an evidence-based belief so much as it is a consensually rooted belief. I just know we think that way about this. And so we try all these ways of disarming the stereotype with no effect. So what we had to do was find a way to eventually make the stereotype not relevant to the test performance. Not relevant to the test performance. So we did that, we could do that very simply by simply doing the experiment over again, and this time before they went in alone to take the test, we told both the men and the women, look, you may have heard that women don't do as well on difficult standardized math tests as men do. You may have heard that, but that's not true for the test you're taking today. The test you're taking today, it's a test on which women always do, always have done, always will do as well as men has done. And what you're basically saying, the subtext of that, is that when you get frustrated here, the stereotype about women's math ability is not relevant to interpreting your frustration, your personal experience. It's not relevant in this instance. And this may be one of the few times in the lives of these women where they took difficult math tests with that kind of freedom from having to, at some level or another, worry about the prospect of that stereotype. And when we did that, thank God, it worked. Their performance rose to match that of equally skilled men. There was no underperformance in that situation. Then Josh Aronson and I did a series of studies with race. I'll just mention one race study so you get an image of it. This isn't one that we did, but it has some niceties to it that I think make it easier to tell as an example. This was, I think Brown and Day did this study, social psychologists, and they gave college students IQ tests, the Rating Progressive Matrices IQ test, which is each item, big square, pattern on the square, 5 little squares. You have to pick which of the 5 little squares has the same pattern as the big square. Just go right through the test doing that. It's really easy, and then it gets really, really hard and frustrating. And when it's frustrating, remember, that's what cues the stereotype about your group as a possible interpretation of what's happening to you in that situation. And we reasoned then that if you didn't say anything to African Americans, just let them take that test, that they're going to have that impact. And sure enough, they did. They scored a standard deviation lower than the white students, which is exactly the size of the IQ difference between blacks and whites in the general population. Again, we had replicated that right in the laboratory. In this experiment, eliminate stereotype threat, to do it over again without stereotype threat in the situation. The nicety of this experiment is because this test was a non-verbal pattern matching kind of test, you could represent it as a puzzle, just as a puzzle that had nothing to do with measuring cognitive abilities. So if the thing was just a puzzle, had nothing to do with measuring cognitive abilities, then the stereotype about your group's intelligence is not relevant, because this isn't an activity that's measuring intelligence. It's not about that. It's a puzzle. And when you're taking a puzzle, frustration is kind of what you're after. You like that. You know, you like, bring it on, man. Bring that frustration on. I want to go at it, which is a very different approach, a very different feeling than the feeling you have if you're trying to prove that your stereotype is wrong. Completely different feeling. Well, when under that, when it was a puzzle, there was no difference between black and white performance of this activity. So, we were getting confidence in the reliability of the phenomenon. It is indeed a situational phenomenon, and I'll describe why that's true in just a second. But these early experiments were giving us some conviction that this was a real phenomenon, and it did have, without any particular tricks, it had the power to affect standardized test performance performance on real life standardized tests. It had the ability to do that. How does it work? I think the best thing to think of when you're trying to understand how it interferes is it makes you multitask. You're doing the one task here at the test, and at the same time, part of your brain is counter-arguing against that. And two things, it's like I was using the example yesterday, you're going to a party, you're going to see some friends you haven't seen in a long time, you're looking forward to it, and as you step out the door, the phone rings and you get some very bad news, very challenging news. So now, you can't stop, you're still on the way to the party, but a big part of your brain is really not there. It's worrying about or contending with this other set of issues there, and you may have the subjective sense that you're fully there, but in fact you're probably not fully. And I think that's the experience of stereotype threat and the mechanism by which it has most of its effects. It is also not something that just happens once and goes away. It's a condition of life in that circumstance. I have one last clip which illustrates this. This is an interview of Charles Blow, the African-American New York Times editorialist. And he's talking about, with Bill Maher, about Trayvon Martin. And he gives you some sense of how stereotypes about African-American males become a kind of chronic feature of life. This is something that you can just disprove and have it go away. And so it's worth seeing that because he puts it so eloquently.
Well, I mean, this is a very interesting point and part of the column I wrote last week, which is about the burden that young black men feel in this country. And it is a very heavy weight on their shoulders all the time because you cannot behave like all of the rest of your friends. You have to watch. I mean, it's almost exhausting consciously paying attention to the way you move your body. Right. It is a physically exhausting exercise to know I can't run or make a sudden movement because now I see some cop standing in the corner and he's looking this way. Or I can't put my hands in my waistband, as George Zimmerman says that Trayvon Martin had his hands in his waistband because that may signal that I have some sort of weapon. The kind of constant having to think about how you are positioning your body so that no one takes advantage of that and views you as suspicious and maybe takes your life or potentially jail is exalted.
You get the chronicity of that from that. What makes this thing strong? What makes it not so strong? As psychologists, I think our first hunches were the classic hunches of the 20th century, which are a long story of how stigmatization affects stigmatized groups. That this being exposed to them, Allport has the famous quote, you can't have a stereotype hammered into you without, there's some internalization happening. So I think probably, our best guess would have been, well, as I think most of us, that's part of our lay psychology, I think, at this point, that the group is exposed to the negative stereotype repeatedly and internalizes it, and then when they're in circumstances where it's relevant, it triggers self-fulfilling behavior. That's probably the dominant story. It was invented, interestingly, by W.E.B. Du Bois, but it was picked up by Freud and used throughout the literature, psychological literature in the 20th century. This is a different story because every experiment that we showed, it wasn't the women, for example, who were the worst, most insecure math students who showed these effects. They didn't show these effects. It was the women who really were good at it, cared about it, and expected to do well in the circumstances. That was the group who showed these effects. Same with African American students. What makes you vulnerable to this effect is not a lack of confidence, but a caring about performing well in the domain. The mistake that Eminem made, if he made a mistake, was that he decided to choose to stake his fate on a domain where his group, interestingly, eccentrically, was negatively stereotyped. And caring about that makes you really distracted by the prospect of being stereotyped. So that was a revelation to us. Well, then what does make it strong? Well, what makes it strong are, just again, leaping over pounds of research. It's cues in the circumstance that suggest that you might, in this situation, be seen in terms of the stereotypes. Just elements of the situation. I walk into a room, I go see my son, who's a musician, play at a nightclub. I'm the only person in the room with gray hair that's as old as I am. And I start to kind of count how many other old people are in this room. And, what am I making out of that? What sense does that do? And I'm just doing it without even thinking about doing it. I'm just doing it. I'm assessing at some level whether this particular identity means something here that might not be so favorable. So it's brought about by just the cue in the situation that I'm the only one there like that. So that's one way in which critical mass has such a big impact on us. If we're a tiny minority, it's hard to function without a heavy awareness or vigilance allocated to assessing stereotype threat and to what that identity is going to mean in this situation. So, and there are many other circumstantial cues, comments made by people, offhandedly, innocently sometimes, can have this, to a vigilant set of eyes, the great power of imposing threat. Sense of threat about that identity. I'm going to talk in a minute about the stereotype threat whites can feel in interracial intergroup interactions. I think is one of the most powerful forms of stereotype threat we've ever seen. And the threat there is that if I make a mistake here and say the wrong thing, I'm going to be seen as racist. That's what the stereotype is. So in situations where that stereotype is relevant, it's an incredibly loaded situation. There's an answer to it. I'll get to that in a second. But I first want to say that in thinking about remedies, I think the first thing to realize is that the threat arises from the circumstance, the situation, the way the situation is structured, the way it's composed, who's in it, the way in which it's organized, the relationship around groups. At the University of Michigan, we did an intervention study years ago, and I won't forget this, that we launched the intervention, we adults came in, we told all the students, this was 250 students in a wing of the dormitory who were going to be part of this program. We told them what a great environment was, how important diversity was. We said every correct thing you could possibly say in that situation. And they listened, kind of, whatever, they're going to be done in a minute. But, like freshmen listen, or don't. But about 3 weeks later, After all that stuff, the whole intervention was wrapped in this. After all that stuff, the sororities and fraternities started to rush. The white kids left the cafeteria, left the black kids in the cafeteria by themselves. This big racial separation happened. And about 3 weeks after that, the black fraternities and sororities rushed. They left the cafeteria, leaving the white kids in. Now, that cube down on the ground, that piece of social organization down on the ground, which is a part of our history, comes from our history, that told them all they needed to know about race, no matter what the adults in the situation are saying. It tells them, look, your life is still deeply organized around this identity. There are powerful, ongoing contingencies tied to this, and you better pay attention to it. And nice what the adults say, but here's the facts on the ground. So a lot of times it is the facts on the ground that are the source of this vigilance and on-edgedness and sometimes alienation that can follow that from that. And I think that's one of the first things to understand. Following that, I think another principle is that if that's the case, then one of the institutional challenges that we have is to enable all of our students to trust the institutional environment. That's a big thing that has to come almost first in order for all students that we now serve in this much more diverse society than it used to be. That the whole task of building trust has to become a primary task. When we had in universities and institutions like this more homogeneous population, that where people, the trust and belongingness wasn't much of an issue in that. To some degree it was, but nothing like it is when you have a broadly diverse a set of students, when you've included students who history has stereotype and the like, and you're trying to make the whole thing work. It's a very different kind of challenge, and I think this research points to the first step being a step of explicitly trying to make it a trusting environment. At Berkeley, the tradition has been, it's one of those tough schools, big public schools, and it's like, you know, you got in here, you're lucky to get in, and boy, you better stand up here and make it. You know, it's like, look to the left, look to the right, that kind of thing. And that might have worked when that was a very homogeneous environment, but it doesn't work very well at all when you have the kind of diverse student body that you currently have. That sends to a pair of vigilant eyes, that sends a signal that they're not trusted. And that their belongingness there is always under test. And that it's almost like the, when did you stop beating your wife kind of question, you know? When could you be good enough that you'd ever prove for everybody in this environment that you belong there? So it's the same kind of behavior that makes sense in one era and circumstance can have very powerfully threatening effects in another era and circumstance. Is building trust sufficient to reduce all of these academic gaps that we worry about? No. It's not sufficient, but it's probably necessary. That's how I would most simply think about it. It's probably necessary. You have to have trust before you can open your heart and engage something, which is in big part what a university is trying to enable its students to do. So that's why it's important. The good news, and I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk about it, but is that if you read chapter 9, there are a lot of techniques which have very dramatic effects because they go precisely at this trust issue. They go precisely at it. They go precisely at the narrative that the student is evolving about the experience of being in the university. They give them a hopeful image. They say, look, they first give the narratives that seem to work real well is to give a student a sense that these anxieties and concerns are normal. They're normal. And you're going to get past them. And when you get past them, you're going to find some amazing rewards in these institutions. These institutions are going to open worlds to you that you just never imagined before. And that kind of the narrative, which can be delivered in all kinds of consistent ways throughout the programming that we use to engage students, can really give them a sense of relaxation in the place so that they can kind of take it on in a much better way. So I think there's an evolution, a cultural evolution that we're talking about. This kind of language, this kind of approach needs to be more foundational in the way we socialize our students. And I would say, if I could characterize the research that I know about, since I'm a little far away and a little long from the truth about research these days, I would say the early phase of this intervention research is very promising. This is one of the wonderful, exciting things about social psychology, that once you know what the issue is and you target it, you can see some very amazing effects in changing performance. And in Chapter 9, there's a whole list of them there. So I want to close by reading something. And you're just about to close me, so. But I thought about this, and I finished this book in a big hurry, and I wasn't sure that I liked the ending of it, but it does make a point, so I wanted to return to that, because I think there's still an underlying unease about dealing with identity, and I want to, so I'll just read you the ending here. Still, after all this is said, we Americans are wary about focusing on identity. Social scientists are kind of desensitized to this, but the broader population, talking about identity, could whatever gain it yields outweigh the divisiveness it might cause? Hasn't our use of race, for example, been one of our society's greatest shames? This is in big part why we so want Obama's election to be marked the beginning of a post-racial era, to put the shame behind us. It is perhaps ironic then, in light of those hopes, that while Obama himself called for Americans of all identities to come together to build an era of progress, he didn't call for a post-racial society or interpret his election as a sign that such a society had arrived. To the contrary, he stressed his racial and other identities, openly embraced them, wrote books about how important they were for him to understand and incorporate into his sense of self. He hungered for a strong, developed racial identity. Here he is in his own words on March 18, 2008, during his famous Philadelphia race speech, in the heat of his campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination. I'm a son of a black man from Kenya, a white woman from Kansas. I was raised with the help of a white grandfather who survived a depression to serve in Patton's army during World War II, and a white grandmother who worked on a bomber assembly line in Fort Leavenworth. I've gone to some of the best schools in America. I've lived in one of the world's poorest nations. I'm married to a black American who carries within her the blood of slaves and slave owners, an inheritance we pass on to our two precious daughters. I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, and so on. He goes on to affirm his identity. Still, and to work through all these identities. Still, it may have gone far, and he was advised by his advisors, if you will remember, not to make that speech, and certainly not to go down that path, that would be ruinous to bring up the issues of identity like that in a presidential campaign. Still, it may have gone farther than anything else he did, I'm arguing, to make non-black Americans comfortable with him as a candidate and eventually as a president. It established a common ground between Obama and a huge swath of the American electorate. We all have identities, often many of them. And despite important differences between identities, a lot of the experience of having one identity is like the experience of having another identity. That he talked about his multiple identities enabled people to see this, to see into their own identities, and what that understanding could tell them about the identity experience of others. These stories of his bridged Obama to the multitudes. They enabled people to see themselves in him, a man who, without these stories about his multiple identities, ironically, would have been seen as just a black man. So I think getting into this is important, and I wanted to end with one experiment. And this is the experiment about white stereotype threat. We had white males come into the laboratory, and they're going to have a conversation with two other students. And the two other students were either two white kids or two black kids. And then they found out that the conversation was either going to be about something easy to talk about, love and relationships, or something difficult, racial profiling. They're going to talk to either two white guys or two black guys about either love and relationships or racial profiling. The experimenter then says, look, I'm going to go down the hall, I'm going to get your two conversation partners and bring them back to the conversation. Would you mind arranging the three chairs here for this conversation?
And as you can imagine, as soon as they arrange those chairs, the experiment's basically over. What we're interested in is, in anticipation of one of these conversations, how do they space themselves? Well, when they're going to talk to two white guys about anything, or they're going to talk to two black guys about love and relationship, they put the three chairs very close together. But when they're going to talk to two black guys about two black strangers, it's important to stress, about racial profile, they put the two black guys over here and they put considerable distance between themselves. It's just loaded. And the more, and what are they thinking about? Well, they're thinking about making a mistake in the conversation that would lead them to be called racist. They're thinking about stereotypes about white people in that situation. And what's interesting is that we had measurements of their level of prejudice. Standard students, they're not extremely prejudiced, but there is some variation among them. And it turned out that the people who in that critical condition, talking to two black guys about racial profiling, put the greatest distance between themselves were the least prejudiced. The pattern of so many of these stereotypes about threat effects, they cared the most about not being seen as racist. So they wanted to avoid it. They wanted to find some other reason for not dealing with that, because it put them in a tremendous situation of threat. Well, eventually there was good news here, and that good news I think it's useful. It's a simple thing. We redid the exact same experiment, but this time, just before they went into the conversation, we said, look, the truth is, nobody really knows how to have these difficult, complicated conversations. These are charged conversations. We don't live in an ahistorical society. There's a history here, and it comes out in these circumstances, and nobody knows really how to do it. But here's a strategy for what you should do in a situation like that. Treat it as a learning opportunity, and ask questions. Just ask questions. Just ask questions. And then they move their chairs close together for that really difficult conversation. Something that when we first finished that research, I doubted they ever would do. But with that simple strategy, to deal with their identities, to be open about it, to be flexible about it, they could, and to treat it really as a learning opportunity, they were able to do that. So anyway, I'll end with that piece of practical advice, and just say that as Obama's many interesting talks have encouraged us to take seriously our identities and to think through them and not be so threatened by them, I hope Whistling Vivaldi does the same thing. Thank you.